sign into the document if you haven't already. I know some people are just joining. New faces. I feel like I recognize most everybody, but maybe Samuel. Do you want to introduce yourself, or does everyone know?
Sure, I've been before. Well, my name's Sam. I'm a product designer from VMware. Yeah, I'm here to talk about the user research study that Kylie and I have been working on.
All right. The first thing on the agenda is something I added, so let me get that sharing. It's a continuation of the thing Joe discussed yesterday. Let's see. All right, so in one of the alternatives to Joe's RFC to create a prepare phase, there was the alternative of reversing the order of the analyze and detect and splitting it into two parts. So writing the analyze.toml in the first part and then moving the bits that actually analyze those layers to the restorer. And so I'd like to kind of open discussion there and figure out, is that something, I think that's the path we'd like to go. I think it's the least amount of changes because it means that we still have the same number of binaries. The order in the next platform release would be swapped and the arguments would be changed. But, functionally it would be very similar to how it is today. So before writing an RFC, kind of wanted to figure out whether I needed to write an RFC to get all the votes, or if it's just sort of moving code around, is a spec change sufficient? I believe that Joe already has a spec pull that reverses this. Yeah.
I like what's in the RC that Joe put up yesterday, which seems a lot like what we discussed. It seems like the open question here is in the RFC, it didn't combine the parts of analyzer that didn't move to prepare with restorer, which I guess is the big open question. I feel like thinking about how the implementation would work, the other thing I want to discuss with this is, though it seems like it could be a last minute detail, I feel like the name actually does matter a lot, which name we choose from a backwards compatibility perspective. So whether we have to ship an analyzer binary that's only used with some APIs, or whether we ship the same binary that works differently in the two APIs. I think if we want to do implementation in parallel, like getting some confidence, but whether we want to prepare analyzer matters more than you might imagine.
My only pushback initially on swapping the two things was the idea that the parts of analyzer that recover the layer metadata didn't feel like they should happen before restore, before we know before detect, before we know what Buildpacks we're going to use. So if we're going to move that portion to restore, and we have, and we maintain the interleaving of privileged, unprivileged, privileged, unprivileged, and don't put two steps next to each other that have those same requirements, that sounds perfect to me. So I'm not, just the idea of swapping keeping the names analyzer and detector and swapping their order, as long as the functionality ends up in the right places, right? That's probably would be my preference. Does anybody feel like they don't like keeping the current names and swapping the order, assuming we're going to distribute the functionality as described?
I don't want to speak on Jesse's behalf, but I know Jesse mentioned that there were a couple things like downloading build packs that you would potentially imagine in that phase that don't fit the name analyzer.
Yeah, I had no objections based on what's currently in there, but I do think at some point, if we decided to download build packs or potentially modify the app directory with like project descriptor, like removing files that are excluded by the project descriptor, then I could see that sort of the analyzer name no longer fitting. But until that's sort of RFC'd, I wasn't going to push too hard.
But both of those things seem like they're ideal in my head, at least, for that prepare phase that's optional, because certain platforms are going to want to exclude outside of container land, right? Like Pack will probably want to exclude things from the upload instead of deleting them in the container because it's local and that makes sense, right? Or Kpack, before it uploads a source blob, if you said you wanted to exclude some credential locally, you wouldn't accidentally want it to end up in your registry, right? So I think there are strong use cases for that excluding ability being something that is optional in container land and can happen outside. And similarly for Buildpacks, right? Some platforms are going to want to, construct the builder image with the correct Buildpacks by by creating a new ephemeral image that has the Buildpack layers orchestrated on it. Some might want to download them dynamically. So even if it's a privileged step sitting next to a privileged step, because that prepare is like kind of a platform specified privileged step, it feels like it's okay for that to be separate to me. I don't know if that changes your opinion about analyzer.
Did you want to keep them as separate phases?
Yeah, I would.
I wonder if it could be like, is the motivation for that just for it to be optional? Because I do wonder if, there's ways to make it optional without making it a separate phase.
I think that's okay too. I'm trying to think if there's a reason why we might want to separate out it's like by separate phase, you really mean separate container, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so like,
I think just having more phases makes it a little bit harder to understand, a little bit slower to run if you're running them in separate containers. So although not everyone might want to use this functionality, I guess my question is it really bad to have it baked in, but just not used by certain platforms to a mandatory phase?
For example, prepare, the platform specific prepare could be a binary that analyzer invokes or something at the beginning, and in which case analyzer might not be a good name for the thing that's going to invoke the platform specific code. Is that kind of
I feel like there are a couple things that enough platforms want that even if not every platform wants it, like downloading Buildpacks. I could see it might make sense just to include, and then we wouldn't have to specify what prepare is, but we can leave that namespace open for platforms to inject their own first container.
I have no preference if anybody feels strongly about renaming analyzer.
I think that could come later. Like, I think moving analyzer with the current stuff we have makes sense to me. And then if we do decide we want to change it, I think we could have this discussion again and symlink it, but that will be after everyone's already moved it to the, the first phase and everything like that. And maybe it's a 1.0 discussion of like, maybe we'll be closer to understanding what we think extensions of prepare might look like.
Emily, you were saying something about wanting to take the name sooner. Maybe I misunderstood.
Yeah, just because I know there was a desire to at least work on the PR in parallel, and thinking what that PR would look like, whether we name it analyzer or prepare actually matters a lot. But I like naming an analyzer and starting with the smaller set of things, and then we can either add in more functionality to this phase and keep the name the same, or add a new phase later if we feel so inclined.
Yeah, for backwards compatibility, we could rename everything prepare now and then have a single, keep a binary that points to prepare for now, right? And then just give it a deprecation.
Yeah, in some ways, keeping the name analyzer, it's simple in that we keep the number of binaries we're shipping the same, which would be helpful for systems like Pack, but it's more complicated in that you have one entry point, then we have to do forking logic. It's really not that different, though, honestly. I mean, not that the amount of work isn't that much different, but the implementation will look a little bit different. I would like to just decide on calling it analyzer but Joe's not here. Do we know if he's coming today?
He is not coming today. He doesn't care what it's named. I was talking to him earlier. He doesn't really care.
He said he might be able to make the second half of the meeting, but that is a maybe.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident he would vote to approve if it was named Analyzer or if it was named Prepare. He actually does not care.
Yeah, I think he just wants it approved one way or another.
Yeah. I feel like naming it Analyzer gives us the most flexibility, because then if we wanted a separate optional step, we still have the Preparer name.
Yep. Yeah, I'd hate to take up a name that we determine is like unsafe to run, or that we want platforms that most platforms won't use because it's limiting or something. As far as progress of this, does it need to? So this RFC is about prepare phase. Should we rename everything? Should I make a new RFC that talks about moving the phases around, or is that a spec change only? Like, how do we want to do this process?
I feel like we could update this RFC, because moving the phases around and what's in this RFC, like, are different ways of describing the same thing mostly.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome.
I think the difference
I will
between
update
that and
this
what's here.
and request everyone review
Yeah.
by next week.
I mean, it's less than our alternatives, right? Of like, that's one of the other options of not doing prepare phase.
Yeah, exactly. I'll swap these around, like how it works and alternatives, and clean all this up to reference Analyzer. And all right, cool, awesome. Well, that's all I've got.
I had one extra question about this actually while we're looking at it. We have a input file that I think most people don't use now, other than I think KPAC uses it, called project metadata, where we include source information. And I think it was the place where we also wanted to copy over some of the metadata values from Project TOML, like authors and documentation URL, as a way of providing them to the lifecycle. Do we think that this phase should also output that? I'm inclined to say yes in the long term, but in the short term, the only thing that's actually in there is the source. And maybe we don't want the lifecycle to be detecting a .git.
Yeah, so KPAC, you lost me there with detecting a .git. What does KPAC do with the .git?
I believe KPAC, if it knows that the source came from a Git repo, it'll provide the commit SHA in project metadata. I think it's something we want to pack to do in the long run. I don't think PAC does it now. And this information ends up in a label on the image. It seems like the kind of thing that the plan we had for this file makes it seem like it should now be owned by this, because we're taking project metadata and putting it into a file for any phase to access. But the one piece of metadata that's actually in that file right now, the source metadata, is not a simple copy paste from Project TOML. It would involve looking to see if this was a Git repo.
Right. I don't think I would be for that. I don't know that it needs to go in this RFC, but I would definitely think that would be something that I would vote yay for, because we're going to need some of the same thing.
Maybe we can just leave it out entirely for now, but it's something we could come back to. I think it might be nice in the long run.
Yep.
I kind of expect a lot of builds that are in Git repos, like with the pack CLI, for instance, to exclude .git before it uploads it into the container, which would imply that like could be useful to have the local platform detect what the commit is, right? And then communicate that back up the lifecycle.
Both, because platforms like Pack are definitely going to do it that way, but a lot of platforms like Tecton just clone in, and they're probably not providing this metadata. And like everyone would have to implement it separately, but we could do it for people.
All I meant was we should support both workflows, not that I prefer one over the other.
This isn't a question that needs an answer now. I was just like tossing it out there as a thing we should probably think about going forward.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Cool. Any more questions on this? All right. The next bit. I believe it was Sam.
Yeah, this should go pretty quick. I have, so I'm working on this research study. We spoke to 2 people in the past yesterday, which was great. Natalie joined for one of the interviews, and I used a researcher from VMware to join another one. I have a couple questions that we're using in the script that I feel like are not like playing the way that I thought they would play, and I was wondering if I could get some feedback. Some feedback from you all on maybe how to make these questions a little bit better. So one of these questions is, so we're speaking to folks who are Docker users today, who may also be users of another more automated kind of container build system, like Buildpacks or Jib or something. And so one of our questions around Docker is which of the advanced features of Docker are they using? And maybe even thinking of these things as advanced features is not even the right way to think about it. But right now, these were the ones that I was able to come up with around like ways people might be using Docker in a more sophisticated way. Are there others that you all would suggest adding in here?
I'd be curious, I guess, to know if they're using Docker like alternatives as well, like, you know, using the Docker CLI, but the some of the like replacements that don't use I forget what it's called, like it's not Packer, is it?
Builda, for instance.
Yeah, Builda. Yeah, there you go.
And what do those provide you? It's like a better UX, or?
I might phrase the question a little more generically, maybe. Like, what tool do you use? Alternative tooling that either wraps Docker or replaces Docker to do builds? Because like I could see, you know, it might be interesting if somebody's using Docker Compose instead of calling Docker Build, right? Or it might be interesting if somebody's using Scaffold to do their iteration on top of Docker. It's like kind of maybe it's maybe just as interesting whether something shells out to Docker as whether it replaces it completely, like if they're using Builder or Podman. I don't know, Jesse, if that.
Yeah,
if
Podman was the one I was thinking of, like the ones
Yeah.
that maybe don't use the Docker desktop installation, right, and wrapping it.
Podman would be like a replace
Yeah,
that has the
it'd be like a
same
drop-in.
UI, and tools like Scaffold are like a wrapper around Docker.
But I think people might not know that exactly. So and keeping it generic will get all of those answers, right? As long as they ask the answer specifically what they're using. That's kind of my thinking.
Okay.
Conoco, right? Might be another.
Which
example.
one is Conoco's replace?
Yeah, Conoco's a replace.
And Packer and Builda, which one do those fall into?
Packer, I think, is like it's a HashiCorp tool from a while ago. I think you're thinking of Podman, right? So maybe
I was
take out
thinking
Packer.
Podman. Yeah, you probably take Packer out.
The 2 above this question, build caching and run as unprivileged user. I don't know how if people are going to understand. It's like when you use build caching with Docker, there's no explicit kind of caching isn't very explicit, right? It's just rebuilding on top of layers that already exist, right? Like a lot of people may just think of it as my builds are a little bit faster. There's no like, you know, kind of build volume you might use to explicitly cache things and restore it. Like, I think that question could be a little confusing.
But there are like some more sophisticated ways to use caching, right? Other than just like your second build is faster, you can be like a little bit thoughtful about what gets cached and stuff. No?
You can design your layers so that they cache more effectively. Like you can hoist your package JSON, and you know, like we have some slides for Cloud Native Buildpacks that are like, do you really want to do this in a Docker file? You know, versus just having build logic that is kind of more organized. So like you could ask it that way, right? How much do you contort your Docker files in order to achieve faster builds, right? That could be an interesting question.
Okay.
Another one that might be interesting would be how many users use like remote Docker, because I know we use volumes and stuff like that. So understanding how many folks are starting to build their images locally to a remote instance somewhere would be useful information, I think.
And if it's a remote instance, is that remote instance part of a Kate's, Kate's distribution, or is it just a standalone install? Where is it coming from?
Okay, and then you guys mentioned that there's a difference in how you would interpret it if someone's using Docker Compose versus Docker Build. The folks that I spoke to yesterday were both using Docker Compose. What's the difference in, like, what's the meaning that you two take out of that if you're using one or the other?
For Docker Compose very specifically, it just meant in your Docker Compose YAML, instead of saying deploy this image, you can say build this directory into a Docker file and deploy it, if that makes sense. And you can't really do that with pack, right? You have to pack build first and then reference the image. And so understanding, like, if everybody in the world isn't using pack because it doesn't fit into their, kind of fast, get it running Docker Compose workflow, that could be really useful information for us.
Okay, so you might be doing a Docker Compose and just composing those containers locally, but you might also be, when you run Docker Compose, if it's in that YAML config file, it might automatically like put it up in your dev environment externally?
Not exactly. This is more about, like, because Docker Compose is for running containers. I mean, it doesn't. Oftentimes when people are using Docker Compose, it's to run containers locally in their Docker daemon, if that makes sense. And
Right.
a lot of those workflows involve pointing Docker Compose at the directory to build that has a Docker file in it, instead of doing a Docker build first and then putting the image reference inside of your Docker Compose.
Oh, I
If
see.
a lot of people are using Docker Compose to replace Docker Run, that's whatever to us. But if they're using it to replace Docker Build and Run, we might want to figure out how to get an integration.
Okay.
Against build kit, probably.
Okay.
What about like volume mounting and stuff like that?
You can't use volume mounting during build with Docker. Or I mean, did you mean more for runtime?
I feel like Sam's asking us for help with this one question. We've come up with like 4 other questions instead.
Great. No, I appreciate it. I like it.
I guess I'm curious about what features. I don't know if this is captured elsewhere in the research survey, but I think when we were planning questions, it's sort of like what features of Docker are people familiar with, even if they're not using it in a build context? Like, do they use bind mounts? People said the network, stuff like that.
Bind mounts. What was the last one? Set the network?
Networking.
Networking. Yeah.
What would you be defining with respect to networking?
Maybe the answer to this question is like we've already made an assumption where we now in pack build let folks change the network on the containers.
Oh, you mean like ports?
I mean, like what network the container is attached to. So whether it's using the host network or it's using a subnet created in the Docker daemon.
This is sometimes used for like connecting during build to like another Docker image that's running that might not be exposed to your normal host, but like, maybe you need to talk to Redis during your build or something like that.
Right.
Or talk to resources that are only available on your corp network. So running your build on the corp network means you would gain access to like Artifactory or something like that during your build, just by virtue of being on the network.
Okay.
One that might be really, or like some functionality that I don't know if we've implemented, in a satisfactory way is Docker kind of recently introduced secrets as like you can build time mount a file into a specific location that has credentials in it. And it's not as powerful as volumes, but it lets you like, inject something that definitely doesn't end up in the metadata. If people are using that a lot, I think people don't really know it exists quite yet, even though it's been out for a while. Is my take. But if people are using that a lot, it'd be good to understand. I think we do have something kind of similar with build time and environment variables essentially, but in the platform, but it'd be interesting to know.
Cool. That's a great one. Okay, yeah, please feel free to keep adding more of these as you're coming to your mind, but I will move on to the next one unless there's more.
Actually, when you say unprivileged user up there, as one of the ones at the top, does that, there's two really different interpretations of that. One is they're running the daemon as an unprivileged user, and the other is they're running the container as an unprivileged user. Like do they use a non-root user inside of the container? I would say non-root even, because it's like, well, even root inside of the containers can be namespaced outside, if that makes sense. I think that'll be just be more clear. Yeah.
Okay, great. Perfect. Okay, and then I have this question that I feel like is just like feels super awkward when I say it. I'm trying to get at this question of sort of like, a container, what goes into your container is kind of a very intimate thing with respect to your application, sort of requires like a lot of trust if you're going to trust someone else to generate that environment for you. So we have sort of like this one-liner, which is describing sort of the idea of Buildpacks very, very generally. It's like a self-creating Docker file that analyzes your code to build a container image without having to write the file yourself. So yeah, I'm sure you guys take issue with this. Is there a better one-liner you would prefer? And then secondly, I'm sort of getting at this thing about like using like how comfortable are you with building your containers using logic that somebody else wrote? And I'm using this phrase logic that's off the shelf, but I feel like that could be better.
I think on one hand, that first, it's like a self-creating Docker file line is very descriptive, or like I think it does describe the outcomes of the project, if that makes sense, for a local build, in a way that I understand why it's like it's helpful for making people understand it. The problem I have is that there are a lot of projects that automatically generate Docker files by templating things into them, and that description gives you an impression about some limitations that cloud native build packs might have, right? Especially working at scale or replacing individual layers, right? That one would assume from that sentence and aren't true, right? That we're kind of a totally different way of building OCI images.
Fair. So with that in mind, you have preferred one-liner?
We often
Replacement.
use transform source into image.
If you said it's a replacement for a Docker file that analyzes your code to build a container image without having to write a Docker file yourself, that could be a small change to what you set up there that helps improve it.
Okay, so maybe this. It's a replacement for a Docker file that transforms source into image without having to create that file yourself.
Yeah, without having to create a file that describes the build configuration imperatively yourself or something.
How about explicitly instead of imperatively?
Yeah, sure. I'm trying to get you don't have to describe the details of the build configuration, but because build packs are modular, you still have the flexibility or control over how it's built. If it can be modular.
Okay. It's a replacement for a Docker file that transforms source into image without having to create a file that explicitly specifies the details of the container.
This specifies the details of the container seems like it's not hitting on the right thing. It's like that explicitly without having to implement all of the build logic yourself. How about that?
Any objections from the gallery? Cool. And then, so there's that sentence, which introduces it. And then there's sort of in this question of like comfort level with, essentially this logic, like how comfortable are you with build logic that someone else wrote, basically. So I think I kind of like, I feel like this like someone else wrote bit is like a little bit not so good.
Gets the point across to me.
Great. And then we have this question, which is like, here's a list of 10 features of a container build system. Can you rank them for us on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of importance to you? And the list of items, which I aggregated after many conversations with SMEs and reading documents and stuff, and Natalie and I worked on this together, is this list. Is there anything that you feel like is missing that we should replace?
This looks great. The one thing is ability to make OS updates as fast as possible. I might be a little, because like this, it feels like a pretty specific feature of Buildpacks, right? I might say ability to patch security vulnerabilities as quickly as possible to make that a little more generic. I don't know if anybody disagrees.
I don't well, I guess security vulnerabilities is very generic, right? Like, cause that could be app level, or like, does that just mean updating an NPM module because it is now out of date in my app?
Because I feel like
it's a very different workflow in Docker, right?
Should we have 3 bullets under it or something that are like, in OS packages ? In for language runtimes or for application dependencies? I guess you're asking to sort the list, so it could also be separate entries.
Yeah, I mean, that could be a follow-up question, like, in this category, rank these 3 things. What was the last one? OS package, language runtimes, and then?
Application modules.
Dependencies. Oh, modules.
Yeah, I almost feel like, at least in a Docker container world, it's like vulnerability in base image or an app code, right? Like thing I can control as a developer versus things I'm inheriting, right?
So maybe fuse the first 2 together. That's a good point. The Buildpacks kind of are that we claim a separation there is pretty Buildpack specific.
And then I feel like that terminology at least is very Docker centric, so it would make sense to people, right? It's like base image versus like code I own.
Yeah, that makes sense. Good.
Nice, I like that distinction a lot. Okay, great. Anything else in here or that's missing?
I think this is great. I'm really excited to hear what people have to say, especially this question.
Yeah.
Maybe we can get a sneak preview at the end about how the first couple interviews went.
Yeah, I can show you the rankings they gave. So this guy works in a like outsourcing shop, or like, build for hire shop in India. And this was his list. Been using Docker for about 4 years.
Speed of builds first is really interesting.
Yeah, he was like, anytime that the container is building this time, I'm not developing.
Makes sense to me because as someone who gets feedback about the lifecycle, performance is definitely the thing I've gotten the most feedback about.
Size of resulting builds or size of resulting images interesting. That's the second thing also.
It's just not surprising to me because I feel like even at like Salesforce/Heroku, like people always bring up the size of the base image all the time, right?
I guess it's
I mean,
not.
I personally would not rank it number 2, but it's not surprising to me that people think about it a lot.
Yeah.
Might be one of those things just like really easy to see, you know what I mean? And they're like, it doesn't actually maybe matter that much, but it's super visible, so it's top of mind.
I almost think the interesting thing to me is that 1 and 2 together would be at the top for the same person almost. You know, like I found some people are really concerned about correctness in building the container. You know, it has a very minimal base image. It looks like this and this. And then some people are very concerned about I can develop quickly and ship my software, right? And so it's almost like neither of those are surprising to be in the top for an individual, but it's almost a little surprising to me that 1 and 2 would go together. I think is what I meant.
Here's the other person.
You might want to remove. I don't know if it's like that has a first name associated with it. I don't know if you want to remove those if these things are being recorded, depending on what people say.
Being recorded right now.
I don't know how big a deal it is.
The name is just the first name. The last names are in here, the email addresses, but
just a reminder that it's a recorded thing if it's data you're getting from people.
And this guy works for a real estate SaaS firm in Texas. I'm just doing a migration of like a rewrite of an app from an older language to a more modern language. So yeah, the fun thing about this is that we'll be able to take an average at the end and be able to have like a aggregated course ranking.
Do you know from this particular app developer if like their use case involves a lot of like custom software or things? I feel like that probably would influence what they would rank. Like being able to like control kind of what packages and stuff go into the image very easily.
I don't think so. I think this is like this is kind of a net new, like more modern one being created. I think his concern is that at his organization, everybody is responsible for their own Docker file for their own app, and he really feels like he wants that personal satisfaction of really knowing why each thing is in there. And you're not blindsided by something. You really know the purpose of every dependency or command.
Yeah, it's interesting that like I feel like it's Steven's comment, right? It's like he cares about like being able to easily update and add things, but then like size of the image is like I think it was like 7 or something near the bottom of that list. So it almost feels like what you just said would make me think that size would be much higher on his priority list, but it isn't.
Yeah, and there's some additional color in the notes about the why of that, but I haven't like gone through it and analyzed it yet.
It's very interesting data. Also, what Terrence said before about being able to correlate this with other, information about what their use cases look like would be really helpful too, I think.
Yeah, we're definitely trying to get that context at the start of the interviews. Great. Well, that's all for me for today. I will keep you guys updated and share some more context soon.
Thanks for running this, Sam and Ali.
I think that's probably last on our agenda too.
Yep, I think so.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
See
have a
you
good
tomorrow.
one.